So, hello everyone. Welcome to PLEAWA's Masterclass on a non-democratic system focusing on Russia. My name is Daniel Tomlinson. I am the president of PLEAWA for this year. I would like to welcome you to our session, I should say. Before we begin, I think it's appropriate to do a quick acknowledgement of country. Most of us are meeting on Whadjuk Noongar country, metropolitan Perth. However, I'd like to extend an acknowledgement to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Western Australia and in Australia abroad for their contributions to education in Australia, and also to a interesting and vibrant political scene in Australia as well, with some of the announcements that were made today, if you were looking at some updates around The Voice. Let's get started straight away. I'm going to hand over to Elina Khvorostova. She's a teacher at Bob Hawke College. She's going to present on Russia as a non-democratic system and add a bit of her personal insights, which hopefully will help you in your studies and your understanding of non-democratic systems. So over to you, Elina.
Thank you, Daniel. So hopefully everyone can see the presentation and the slide share. Hopefully you've got it in front of you. Thank you very much for taking the time, and thank you, Daniel, for your wonderful introduction. I am a teacher at Bob Hawke College, and as you probably saw and identified with my last name, I do come from Russia, and I do have a bit of an overlap with the Russian and Ukrainian background. Having been born and raised in Russia, I do have quite a bit of a passion for the history and the way that political system has been structured and changed throughout time. So I'm really looking forward to sharing some of my insights and some of the most recent changes that Russian political system went through. Now, this presentation does contain a lot of slides and a lot of detail. I don't think I'll be able to cover all the parts that I have included, but the slides will be made available to all students and teachers. So you should be able to dive a little bit deeper into some of the topics we might not have the time to cover today. But what I'll generally try to do is I'll just give you a little bit of an overview of what is the Russian political system, political and legal system like, how is it structured, how does it work in theory versus practice. And the incredible Mr. Basell later will give you some teacher and student tips on how to actually apply the syllabus. So at this stage in your year 11 journey, you should have covered democratic processes, kind of enhancing your current understanding of what Australian government is like and how does it work. And you should be very familiar with the generic democracy checklist. So we know that effective democracies do vary in how they're structured and how they operate, but they do tend to have some common characteristics. One of the most important, arguably so, is limits to power and that key concept of constitutionalism, having very clear outline of how the government is structured, how does it run from the day-to-day to the more crisis situations, and having those very clear checks and limits on power. Free and fair elections is another key component that we'll have a look at today, having, again, access to the voting places, variety of candidates, use of the secret ballots, and the lack of government control and intervention and coercion, lack of corruption throughout those processes is very important. And lastly, we will have a look at citizen participation and just the ability of different members of society, eligible citizens, to actually get involved in the process, have a say, join political parties, and basically have their democratic freedoms protected. Now, a very interesting way to actually make those comparisons is to have a look at the Democracy Index, which is something that the Economist Intelligence Unit regularly updates. What I have here for you is the latest data, and it's very interesting to see and compare from year to year, in particular with the focus on the European region. Quite a lot of European regimes have actually dropped in their rating of the health of their democracy, Russia being one of those countries, and very interestingly, its immediate neighbour, Ukraine. And generally, democracy is in decline, especially since the COVID 2020 pandemic. More on that a little bit later. If I just focus on the region in Europe, Russia currently arguably is no longer in the category of just a flawed democracy, but we are heading into not just a hybrid regime, but we are also heading into the authoritarian zone. Again, interesting note that in 2020, about 49.4% of the world's population lived in some sort of democracy, mostly flawed or hybrid regimes, but this has dropped substantially to 45.7% in 2021. meaning that 37.1% of the world's population currently live in an authoritarian regime. So this is becoming more of a rule rather than an exception. So it's really important to understand, why are democracies slipping? How does it work? And what can be done about it? So in terms of the syllabus that we are focusing on today, this is hashtag 11PAL5. I'm a big fan of using the hashtags in your studies so that you can actually find some rich examples. You need to actually understand what is the difference between a democracy and what is an autocracy. So a key idea, a key definition here, which will be good to note, is that autocratic government is just a type of government where the political and legal power is unlimited, not restricted, and instead it's concentrated in a single entity. So we have rule by law in contrast to rule of law, lack of checks and balances. And we'll have a look in particular, how is this related to Unit 1 syllabus. Now, Russia is a very interesting choice as a non-democratic country, a study of comparison to Australia. It's very unfamiliar to a lot of you. So on paper, the state power in Russia is exercised by usually the President, Federal Assembly, which is a bicameral body that consists of the State Duma and the Federation Council, the government and the courts. It is also known as a democratic republic. The extent of democratic will be discussed today. It is a federal state like Australia. If you don't know, Russia is the biggest country in the world, so the number of state regional authorities is quite substantial. There's up to 85 states, so it's quite a difficult country to govern when it comes to regional disagreements and just the multicultural aspect of the state, and it does feature a written constitution. So, the Russian constitution is actually quite a minimalistic document. It does only contain 9 chapters and 137 sections in total. But when you actually look at the nature of the constitution, what I've got here is a little bit of an extract of a preamble, emphasizing the ideas and the intent of the actual founding fathers of this constitution. So this is actually adopted in 1993 after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. More recently, the Constitution has gone through very substantial amendments in 2020, which have become official in 2021 after a couple of laws were passed as well. So if we just have a look at the chapters, chapter 1 includes the overview, just outlining the fundamentals of the operation of government. And we're looking at some of the fundamental chapters that just set up the way the country will be governed, fundamental focus, and setting up the democracy. Chapter 2 focuses on actual articles of rights of man and citizen, which are enshrined in the Constitution. Chapter 3 just covers the federal structure. Chapter 4 focuses on the powers of the president. Chapter 5 on the actual powers of the legislative branch and the executive in Chapter 6. 7 being left to the judiciary. 8, again, local self-governments, which are smaller authorities, again, due to the sheer size of the actual country. Those are very necessary to just manage local matters like local councils, if we compare that to Australia. And the last chapter is left over to the constitutional amendments and how the constitution can be changed. This document, being very substantial and quite democratic, if you examine the individual chapters and the articles, this document was substantially changed in 2020 with over 41 amendments that were passed with overwhelming support by the people. So the actual statistics do show that over 73% of people voted in favour of these changes. So we'll have a look at what actually happened and what are those changes. Article 10 of the Constitution sets out the fundamental principle of a liberal democracy, the separation of powers. So according to Article 10, in the actual Constitution, we're looking at the power of the Russian Federation exercised on the basis of division of the government powers into 3 separate branches. And it clearly states there that the intent is these branches shall be independent. A couple of key terms that you need to understand. So within the legislative branch, we do have a bicameral Federal Assembly, the State Duma and the Federation Council. They are completely 2 different beasts. They serve completely different purpose. The executive does consist of a president, but also of a prime minister. And as for the judiciary, we have a couple of courts and a hierarchy of courts, but the two of the most important ones worth noting in this presentation are just the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court. So what I try to do is just, I try to visualize the way these different branches interact together. In purple, we've got the judiciary, in red, we've got the executive, and in blue, we have the legislative branches. So theoretically, every eligible Russian citizen is able to exercise their democratic right, and if they choose to do so, it's not compulsory to vote in Russia. They can vote directly for the presidential candidates every 6 years. And again, presidential terms change quite frequently. So more on that when we talk about it a little bit later. And also the Duma, the lower house of the parliament, of the Federal Assembly, which consists of 450 members. The voters use a very interesting model, which is called parallel voting, where they elect the Duma deputies every 5 years. And those will be essentially their representative in parliament that are meant to represent their wishes and debate the contemporary issues. Now, in the Duma, like I said, the parallel voting, just very simply, is proportional representation for the political parties that receive, again, a majority vote there, and also the other half essentially is assembled to the candidates as per the preference of the voters. If I just simply simplify that, that's how it works. Very interestingly, unlike our Australian Senate or the upper house of our parliament, the Federation Council in Russia, which is meant to be a representation of the states, they're not elected. So instead, every state government, they will actually send delegates, so 2 chosen delegates from 85 federal subjects, and their job is to essentially represent the interests. One of those delegates traditionally is meant to be a member of the executive branch in the state parliament, and the other is meant to be from the legislative. So a very interesting process of selection, and there's 170 members. Now, from the Duma, we do have a formation of the federal government, and this is just the party who secures a majority. It is traditionally one political party for the last 20 years that dominates and has control of the Duma, with a variety of other parties present. And from there, we have a federal government with the ministry and the prime minister. Now, the way the executive works, the president does have a lot of power and control, but the president actually approves and appoints, with the approval of the Duma, the prime minister. And so the portfolio of the portfolios and the ministries are assigned from that point onwards. The prime minister is usually from the same political party as the president, or from with the same values. Completely separate, we're looking at the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court. And technically, they are meant to provide the checks and the balances and check the powers of the president and the other branches and enforce the Constitution. With the new amendments, the presidential scope of power has been enhanced, and it does allow for the president, under certain circumstances, to actually dismiss the judges, which is an interesting correlation there. Now, if we just dive in a little bit deeper into the legislative branch, if we first talk about the most powerful chamber, that is the State Duma. So like I said earlier, elected every 5 years, and it consists of 450 members, or the deputies who represent their local electorate. So they are responsible for adoption of federal constitution and federal laws. They control all the government activity, appointment and dismissal of heads of central bank, the Human Rights Commissioner. They also issue, and cooperate with other foreign states and governments. And usually, to make any laws, this is the way of the Russian lawmaking process works, is you require 66% or 2/3 of all members of parliament to make any constitutional amendments or to pass any laws. So it does require the majority. If we have a look at the most recent Duma election, so the Russian President Vladimir Putin's party has actually won a parliamentary majority following an election. There has been a lot of criticism from the Western states and also within Russia about the allegations of fraud and other barriers in participation. some of the biggest critics of the president have also been disallowed from participating or running for office due to a couple of local factors. But if you have a look at the numbers, the United Russia Party does have a majority. They traditionally have control of the Duma, and they have roughly 324 seats out of 450 at the moment. So they do have a majority, so they are able to actually pass laws and amendments without any challenge. The second largest party, interestingly, is still the Communist Party. Then there's a Liberal Democratic Party and a couple of other minor parties. When it comes to opposition in Russia, there are a lot of barriers to have effective opposition and to critique regime and, uphold the accountability function. One of the biggest smaller parties that have been on the rise in the last decade are the New People, whose leader is currently arrested, and it is Alexei Navalny, and we will talk about him a little bit later. Now, when it comes to the powers of a prime minister, there's quite a bit of an overlap between the powers of the president and the prime minister, because they do both play an important role within the executive. So as I've mentioned earlier, the prime minister is appointed by the president, again, every 6 years after presidential elections. And the way you can think about the role of the prime minister in Russia is in a very similar state as the role of the vice president in the United States. It's the second most powerful person in terms of the powers and the scope of authority. But again, they are appointed, not elected, and they act as a president's deputy. They head cabinet meetings. They also implement domestic and foreign policy. They carry out presidential decrees and laws, and they also are in charge of the management of government portfolios, economy, labor, and other important areas of government. The next election that will affect the outcome and the appointment of the prime minister is coming up next year, as the presidential elections are upcoming. Now, the most interesting branch of government to discuss when it comes to Russia is undoubtedly the executive branch, with a focus on the powers of the president. So according to Article 81, subsection 3, the same person cannot hold a position of the presidency of the Russian Federation more than 2 terms in a row. This was a very important clause of the Article 81, which was removed in 2020. Historically, the presidential terms have actually changed more than 3 times, and each time the presidential terms are adjusted, they're usually extended. So the latest adjustment, again, was in 2008, where the presidential term was 4 years, it was extended to 6. So in terms of the powers of the president, what do you need to know? Traditionally, head of state appoints the prime minister with the Duma's approval, issues decrees that carry weight of law. Russian president symbolically is the representative and the protector of the constitution and citizens' rights. The Russian president does have the right to dissolve the parliament, the Duma, and they're in charge of overseeing foreign policies, regional relations, state security, and they're also the commander or in chief of the armed forces. So a very powerful role that does have a lot of really interesting consequences that we'll discuss. Whether you were aware of this or not, but if we'll actually look at the cumulative years of Vladimir Putin in power, cumulatively, he has been a president for about 16 years. He has served 4.5 years as a prime minister. So all up, we are talking about a president who's been in power for about 20 years. In terms of his approval ratings within the local population, in 2020, the approval rating of Vladimir Putin was roughly about 2/3, so over 66% of population still supported or approved of presidential actions, which is slightly lower than the average 75% of approval ratings that Mr. Putin has enjoyed previously, which is an interesting point. If you want to actually jump into the history and the previous roles prior to being president, there are some interesting points to discuss. But if we just focus at the issues at hand, first elected as a president in 2000, re-elected as a president for the second consecutive term in 2004. With the limit of 2 successive terms, he was essentially serving as a prime minister for some time, with his re-election and coming back to power in 2012. With the changes to the constitution, which have passed in 2020, theoretically, he can remain in power for a little bit longer. So in terms of that, there was a referendum, a national vote on the changes, on the proposed changes to the constitution that were put to the Russian people. Like I said, there were 41 amendments in total that were put to the people. Some of them were quite minor adjustments. However, some were quite substantial. So those were passed with success by the majority vote by the population. And in April 2021, Vladimir Putin actually signed the legislation that technically allows him to stay in power up until 2036, when he should be roughly about 83 years old, which is an interesting point. And all up, he's been in power for over 20 years. In terms of the presidential powers and the substantial amendments that were introduced, some of the amendments that are worth mentioning is a proposal was made to remove the row of clauses regulating the number of maximum terms. So the proposals for constitutional change started in the Duma, and it was they were delivered as part of a speech of one of the conservative members of the United Russia Party. And after the initial proposal, there was quite a committee that formed to discuss these changes. Some of the proposals including to actually nullify the number of presidential terms that the current president could serve. So they directly were addressing the president in power, allowing him to remain in power afterwards. Some of the proposals also expanded the power of the legislative body, the Duma, allowing them to actually have more of a say in the selection of the prime minister. And the biggest interesting change that was actually included in the constitution is the definition of marriage was also enshrined in the constitution to be simply between a man and a woman, making it an interesting link to human rights in different countries outside of Australia. As you probably noticed, considering Vladimir Putin was a president and then he stepped down to be a prime minister and then he came back to be a president, there is quite an overlap, and the way that the two branches are structured are probably a little bit unclear in terms of how this can work in practice. So this changing relationship between the position of being a president and then a prime minister shows that theoretically you can occupy both and come back into power that way. It also shows us that the Duma has limited check on executive power. And although you can remove the prime minister for 2 repeat votes and reject the PM appointment, that is very unlikely to happen. The process of removal of the president, technically, that is possible according to the constitution. It does require the president to be impeached, which is something that is started by the Federal Assembly and does involve the formal trial by the courts, but also the president theoretically can dissolve parliament or the most powerful branch of parliament, chamber of parliament, which is the Duma. So quite a little bit of an overlap of how these branches work in practice, which results in a little bit of an unclear relationship between the two. What I really wanted to discuss was also one of the contemporary issues which students and teachers are probably familiar with. Russia historically has struggled having an effective and meaningful opposition. So opposition to the current Putin's regime, which again, this is something that has been going on for the last 20 years, has existed and has its ups and downs, but it is very limited. So in terms of the United Party, the biggest, most popular party historically, who do have control of the Duma, which is depicted on the right there. So United Russia has a lot of power. So currently they have over 72% of votes in the Duma. They are the most popular choice during the elections, and they do sway Duma and dominate the lawmaking process and any changes. And they were very heavily involved with the constitutional amendments. They are the the main party that does tend to be criticized by the smaller parties due to the numbers and allegations of fraud. Theoretically, executive has been ruled by the United Russia Party for over 20 years. The party has gone through a couple of stages of actually being changed and renamed and rebranded. In the last 2 elections from memory, Russian president actually ran as an independent, running separately to the United Russia Party. But if you look at the history and relationship between the two, there's a very clear link. The regime over the last 20 years has also been accused on a number of occasions of assassinating some of its most vocal, most popular critics, both in Russia and overseas. For example, in 2009, Sergei Magnitsky died in police custody after allegedly being brutally beaten and denied medical care. And the most prominent example of recent assassination, which possibly is linked to the government, was in 2015, when a very vocal Russian politician who opposed Putin's regime quite openly was assassinated in the center of Moscow on a bridge near Kremlin. In terms of Russian political parties, as previously mentioned, on the political spectrum, the views of the United Russia Party, the Conservative Party, they align quite closely with the Liberal Democratic Party, who do have some very more right-wing conservative beliefs. There's also a couple of other parties that are very popular in some more remote regions, like the Communist Party of Russian Federation and the Just Russia Party, which are quite patriotic and extremist in some of their policies. A party that is on the rise, which I've previously mentioned, would be Alexei Navalny's party, which is known as New People. But in terms of their role and of the extent of their influence, it is quite difficult to achieve change with very limited seats in the Duma, especially when the leader of the political party is in jail, in prison, arrested for a couple of convictions. So generally speaking, protests in Russia are usually violently suppressed, and any opposition that is quite vocal and is able to gather some numbers, they're usually suppressed and routinely arrested and jailed. Some most vocal members of opposition usually receive prison sentences. The most recent, most powerful example that is worth noting is, again, the leader of the New People political party, Alexei Navalny, a very vocal critic of Vladimir Putin and United Russia Party. He has recently been given a 9-year prison sentence after a fraud conviction, in addition to his previous 3.5 years for parole violations. So just for your information, Navalny allegedly violated his probation when he sought medical treatment abroad, when after being poisoned by a very powerful nerve agent. And many suspect that potentially Putin's regime was behind the poisoning, which almost led to Alexei Navalny's death. Now, on the night that Navalny was initially jailed, there was quite an outrage by the population, by the public, by his supporters, with over 1,000 of his supporters and members of his political party were also arrested. I did include his tweets, so he's very vocal on the social media, where you can actually see his open criticisms and opinions on some of the recent developments in a Russian political and legal system. In terms of his popular support, he does still enjoy quite a lot of, essentially support from the younger Russian population, as he's a little bit less conservative than the majority parties. But he has been very vocal about the accusations against him and the fact that those prison sentences are essentially just exaggerated to prevent him from criticizing the regime. One of the most relevant examples to discuss with a focus of Russian political and legal system is the recent outbreak of the war in Ukraine. It has been heavily televised. It has been very present in the social media, but it's really important to actually understand, how does the invasion of Ukraine demonstrate the nature of authoritarian regime in Russia and the need to defend a nation's sovereignty? So what we're going to discuss for this part of the presentation is what are the connections between the event of Ukraine being invaded? How is this linked to the way the Russian system of government is actually formed? How does it operate in theory versus practice? And then we'll have a look how you can actually use this contemporary case study in application to the syllabus. Just a little bit of history before we dive into the political and legal issues, but I do have to warn the students in particular, if you are going to focus on discussing this example and war in Ukraine as part of your demonstration of how Russia is a non-democratic state, you have to be careful to keep it factual and to prevent yourself from going into more of a historical narrative, as some of the history students tend to do. So the historical context that I will discuss here is relevant. However, you need to keep bringing it back to the structure, the way the Russian political and legal system works, rather than the history and the protests outside of Russia. So for those of you who don't know much about the history between the two countries, it is dating back to the origins of both Russia and Ukraine, because both states do enjoy quite a rich and long history dating back to Kievan Rus back in medieval period. So long history, a lot of conflict historically between the ethnic Ukrainian population and the central Moscow regime, but these conflicts do culminate after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, with the Ukrainian government finally being given the sovereignty and opportunity to control the development of its political and legal system. So in the 2000s, both the Russian state and the Ukrainian state did experience a lot of turbulence, a lot of instability due to the changes and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And both countries try to establish themselves as democratic. But due to the presence of corruption and lack of separation of powers in both of the states and the scope of the executive power, in particular in Ukraine, there was quite a popular uprising in 2004, which became known as the Orange Revolution. So in terms of what the Ukrainians want, Ukrainian population even today does still have a substantial Russian-speaking population, especially in eastern regions. The Donbas region, which experienced a lot of the civil fighting, and also the brink of the Russian invasion in 2021 is particularly high in representation of Russian speakers. But in 2000s, the Ukrainian government was negotiating the possibility of the Ukraine joining NATO and also the European Union. So in the 2004 Orange Revolution, this was very much expressed by the public in terms of wanting reform and improvement, and the people basically wanted improvement to their leading standards. The revolution did not result in substantial change, and the president at the time still chose to continue with the Russian foreign relations. Coming forward to 2013 and 2014, due to, again, majority of the population wanting to join the European Union, but the president at the time being a supporter of the Putin regime, what happened was the government officially rejected the application to the European Union, which resulted in the so-called Maidan Revolution, the popular uprising, which overthrew the regime. As you're probably familiar, during this point of instability of a new temporary government in Ukraine, this is where Russia did illegally seize and annex the southern region of Crimea, which essentially escalated into a civil conflict with a Russian-backed separatists in the Donbas region of Donetsk and Luhansk, with a war and conflict that has been ongoing there from 2014 to today, which culminated in 2022 with the so-called special military operation of the official invasion of Ukraine by the Russian forces, which at the moment, one of the contemporary issues within Russia itself, which the issue was created as a result of the special military operation, at the moment, the key human rights concern in Russia is the conscription debate and the partial military mobilization. But that's just the historical context that is relevant to the way this conflict is perceived both in Russia and abroad. So if you actually look at the conflict and look at the individual events, it is a very rich case study for democratic rights and freedoms, constitutional protections in theory versus reality, the right to assembly and protest, freedom of expression, and the ability of their population to criticize the government. In particular, throughout this time, ever since the invasion of Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens have taken it upon themselves to protest against the illegal invasion, to criticize Putin's decision to go to war. Hundreds of them have been arrested and issued with, accusations of criticizing the state, and the accusations have resulted in some jail sentences. The right to assembly and protest in this way has been very much removed from the population, with the population being unable to freely express anything critical about the effort in the war in Ukraine. In terms of human rights during war and conflict, a lot of information has also been made available in regards to the treatment of the prisoners of war and the treatment of the combatants during this time, with some of the accusations that have come out recently with the International Criminal Court, for example, introducing the open criticism of Vladimir Putin and issuing essentially a warrant for his arrest if he does actually enter any state that does support the ICC and its decrees. So ultimately, openly criticizing Putin for allegations of forcible removal of children from Ukraine into Russia. And of course, in terms of the decision to go to war, at the moment, it's very difficult to say with the accurate numbers in terms of support of the war, but a very significant proportion of Russian population is very openly against the conflict, but are simply unable to do anything about it due to the nature of the government and the oppression on its people. Again, not having a viable and powerful opposition in the Duma, and without being able to openly criticize the regime, the efforts to end the war in Russia have not seen any fruition. They have been very unsuccessful. And it also demonstrates to us the scope of the roles and powers of the president in an autocratic regime, such as Russia at this point. So the culmination of the war and the fact that the government was able to make a declaration that is quite unpopular with its own local population, which is reflected in the protests and the mass migration, especially by men who were called upon and conscripted to go to fight. The numbers at the moment are not quite certain because it is an ongoing process, but it is estimated that over 400,000 men have actually chosen to flee the country rather than to go and fight in Ukraine when the partial mobilization was introduced. So very interesting example. Again, I would recommend to stay away from the emotional part of this case and just stick to the facts and focus on how does this example actually demonstrate the lack of democratic processes, accountability, lack of representation, oppression of control of the media and the press, suppression and the police violence when it comes to freedom of assembly and protest, and the lack of those constitutional protections in practice. That would be an interesting one to discuss. In a perfect world, this cartoon, I think, sends quite a clear message. So if the people of Russia were not happy, which arguably a lot of Russian population do not support the war or have relatives in Ukraine, theoretically, in a great situation, ideal situation, actions of the government or president who does act in an authoritarian manner should be checked and balanced. But unfortunately, with Russia as it is at the moment, that is not plausible.
Okay, thank you so much, Elina, for all of that relevant information. I've just taking a deep breath, come up for air after taking so many notes. I've got post-it notes coming out the wazoo. So thank you so much. I'm actually going to hand over to, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. We will get to them towards the end of the presentation. But for now, I'm actually going to hand over to Ben Basell. Ben Basell is a teacher at All Saints College. He's a politics and law teacher, has been for some time. He's, I know, very passionate about cognitive science and study skills. And so he's going to take you through how you might actually process this information yourself actively so that it's useful to you in assessments, as well as potentially like use this in class, including for any teachers that are in the audience. So I'll hand over to you, Ben. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And thank you so much to Elina for that excellent presentation. I've certainly learned more about Russia than I thought I ever would. So that's fantastic. I'm just going to share my screen here and hopefully everybody can see that. Is that all looking good? Can you give me a... Yeah, great, excellent. So I am going to share, by the way, apologies for the picture on the front slide there. I thought there had to be a shirtless Putin on a horse somewhere in this presentation. I couldn't disappoint. Look, I'm going to give you some of the ideas from my classroom, how I engage with this part of the course. That's not to say that this is the be-all and end-all, and I'm sure that there are lots of other great ideas out there from P&L teachers. So please feel free to contribute those at the end if we've got time for questions. So I think, in my humble opinion, that this is a great topic in the syllabus for an investigation. The teachers in the room will know that one of the types of assessments that we are required to do is an investigation, and we need to do 2 investigations. So we've just been doing this at the moment with my class, actually. Here's how I pose it to the students. They have to research a 21st century dictatorship, and then they have to prepare a report card showing how democratic or undemocratic that country is. And then they have to prepare the same report card for Australia. So they have to do a comparison. And then at the end of that investigation, at the end of that research, they have to do an in-class validation, an in-class essay. So I suggest some countries to them. Russia is obviously at the top of the list, but other countries like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, which is mentioned in the textbook, Myanmar, Belarus, Iran, Cambodia, Egypt, and Hungary are all good candidates for non-democratic countries. So students all go off and do their own research, and I give them a template like this to fill out. This is taken straight from the democratic checklist in the Stephen King textbook. So you can see down the left-hand side there, there's 3 major categories. The first major category includes some kind of general principles of government, I guess, like constitutionalism, separation of powers, rule of law, representation, accountability, and majority rule. And then the second category there is to do with elections. So things like secret ballot, universal suffrage, non-biased elections, and having the majority will reflected by the electoral system. And then the third major category there is for things like human rights. So tolerance for a wide range of political views, freedom of association, freedom of speech, and other individual rights. So they've got to go and do their research. And by the way, apologies to my students who've just been doing this, who might be in the room. They've got to go away and do their research in each of these categories and put examples of where those things are upheld in both Australia and their chosen country, and examples of where those things are challenged. Now, quite often they'll come to me and say, oh, Mr. Basell, I can't really find any examples in Russia of where tolerance for political views is upheld. So that can be a challenge sometimes of not finding positives, but that's okay. It just means there's some rich comparisons to be had with Australia. So I think that's I always say to my students, tables are your best friend in politics and law, and this is a message for the students in the room as well. I think tables can be excellent tools for organizing your thoughts about all sorts of things. So whether it's this application, or whether it's looking at arguments for and against, or advantages and disadvantages, I just think tables are an excellent way and an excellent addition to your notes to organize your thoughts. I give them a couple of websites to use, and I'm sure lots of people out there are familiar with these next couple of websites, but just in case people aren't, I and my students find these websites really handy. The first one is Freedom House. So Freedom House has a great website where it's got this interactive map, which you can see on the right there. And when you hover your mouse over the different countries, it gives you basically a freedom score of how free or how democratic that country is. So you can see there that all the green countries, they're pretty democratic countries. All the yellow countries, they're considered partial democracies, and then all the purple countries, they're considered non-democracies. So when you hover over Russia, I think it gives them a score of about 3 out of 100. I think some countries like Syria even have minus scores out of 100. But what happens is when you click on a country, you can access a report that's got a huge amount of information about different parts of that country's system, a lot of which line up really well with that democratic checklist from the textbook. So you can see here just one section from the report on Russia about the electoral process. And the particular thing it's looking at here is, was the current head of government elected through free and fair elections? So then the students can use that for their research. So really good resource for both students and teachers there. The other website I direct them towards is Human Rights Watch. They produce reports on every country and their human rights performance. So there's a little snippet from Australia's report from last year. And it goes into all sorts of things like Australia's treatment of asylum seekers, Indigenous rights, and that's particularly useful for that last section of the democratic checklist on individual rights. So just a couple of websites there that hopefully you can use whether you're a teacher or a student. So the students have done their research, you've done your research, and then you need to do a validation, which is an in-class essay. So I try to give the students, particularly at the beginning of year 11, lots of practice at putting together paragraphs and lots of scaffolding for that. So I've got an example here of an exercise I have given students in the past, where I've got a suggested structure for a paragraph about Australia's separation of powers. And then I've got a sample paragraph here about the separation of powers in Australia, and then some suggested sentence starters for how they might contrast their chosen country. And then I've got some other suggested paragraphs for them about the electoral system in Australia and the civil liberties afforded to people in Australia. So that was my first iteration of that, which has kind of developed into this iteration here, where I've taken a sample question. This is a practice question straight out of the textbook, out of the questions at the end of chapter 4 in the textbook. And I've written a sample introduction. And I've tried to color code it so that I point out where I've defined my key terms. So this question is about separation of powers. So I need to have a definition of separation of powers, which you can see there in red. I try to point out to my students that it's important to explain why these concepts are important or why they're significant. So you can see that there in blue. And then, of course, they need a thesis, an answer to the question in their introduction. And you can see there, I've created my own fictional country of Basell, just so I'm not treading on any of their toes. So I'll just give everyone 2 ticks to read that. Okay. So then I've got another sample paragraph where I talk about an example. So trying to emphasize to the students that concrete and detailed examples are very important in P&L to illustrate our arguments. So this is for both students and teachers now. So I've got an example here of Australia's independent judiciary and the provisions that are in our constitution for protecting the independence of the judiciary, and then some concrete examples of how our judiciary has been able to check the power of both the legislature and the executive. And then you can see there I've got some color coding for introducing the example and for having a linking sentence at the end of the paragraph. So I'll just give everyone a second to read that. Okay, so then I try and gradually remove the scaffolding so the students can start to bring in some of their own material. So I start by asking them to write a paragraph about the separation of the executive and the legislature in the Australian system. But I give them some sentence starters. So, however, and I always try and say to students, I know Hayley Pepper from Perth College says this all the time, what's your however phrase? So remember, in essays, you get 7 marks for evaluation. So you always want to make sure that you are indicating that you can consider both sides of an argument and counter arguments. So in purple here, I've got an opposing argument. However, the executive and the legislature are not completely separated in Australia. So then I want students to finish that thought about how the executive and the legislature are fused in Australia. We can talk then about that arrangement having both advantages and disadvantages. So using phrases like on the one hand, and then on the other hand, and then making sure that students get used to including examples. So I've given them the prompt here that question time here is an example of, and hopefully I want them to write something like, it's an example of the legislature holding the executive to account in Australia. And then looking at the counter argument to that. However, because of its dominance of the House of Representatives, the government is able to, and then hopefully students finishing that thought with the executive being able to dominate proceedings and legislation in the House of Representatives. And then giving them a sentence starter for a final linking sentence. So that's a heavily scaffolded paragraph. And then the last step is to ask them to write a paragraph on their own. Write a paragraph explaining how separation of powers works in your chosen non-democracy. Giving them the prompt that obviously there needs to be a topic sentence, an explanation, lots of evidence, and a linking sentence. But other than that, they're on their own, hopefully using some of the tips that they've picked up until then. And then I give them some transition words and phrases that can make their sentences and paragraphs more complex and more rich and more interesting. And I think they can be helpful as well. So that's my process, essentially. Obviously, there's going to be lots of other ideas out there. I don't pretend that mine is the only way. And hopefully it works. My students have got their essay this coming Monday, so hopefully all that has worked with them. And I'm happy to take any questions. There's Kim Jong-un with Dennis Rodman there, another dictator. Kim Jong-un, that is, not Dennis Rodman. All right, that's me.
Oops, couldn't pin myself. If anybody has any questions at this point, please feel free to drop them in the chat, voice them to Ben and Elina, and maybe we can facilitate a very quick discussion of anything that was confusing or anything you want additional information on.
I have a quick question for Elina,
Mm.
if she's still here.
Yes, she is, I believe.
Okay, yeah. I was wondering if, I know with the invasion of Ukraine, there was some resistance or disquiet in the military about the invasion. Is there any sense that elements of the military might turn against Putin and stage a coup of their own?
Look, it's an excellent question, Ben, and thank you for asking. I would say historically, the Russian government has enjoyed the support of the military. Putin being, again, in charge of the military forces is very unlikely. There has been quite a lot of discontent, however, especially from the southern regions and the cultural minority groups, because interestingly so, they have been affected by the partial conscription the most. So there has been some data that has come out in last year that the regions that are actually being partially selected by the government to be sent to fight in Ukraine, they come from minority regions within Russia. And there's been quite a lot of discontent on the racial basis that why is it they're not ethnic Russians were being sent to fight, which has been very interesting. But apart from those minor protests in some parts of the country, unfortunately, at this stage, it doesn't look like that would make a big difference. But again, just the sheer number of the Russian men fleeing, and from my personal experience, having family there and friends that I grew up with, everyone who could leave the country prior to them being conscripted, they did. And that is a very high proportion of the population who do have the knowledge and education about what's actually going on and who don't support it. So the issue, the human rights issue with that I find really fascinating is some of the decisions by the Western nations to actually not grant asylum to the Russian men fleeing conscription, because again, that is not their choice. And the other side is that some Western states rejecting those individuals seeking asylum, saying that instead they should go back and fight for change. So at the moment, countries like Turkey, they have experienced the highest number of Russian population moving there, escaping conscription, which is very interesting.
Elina, I had a question. Throughout your presentation, you were talking about the powers of the executive seem to keep coming up quite a lot. And two that stuck out to me is the president can, I think you mentioned that the president can, in some situations, dismiss judges, and the president can also dismiss the Duma. That is, the executive can dismiss the other arms of government, right? So I was wondering, are there any conditions that have to be fulfilled in order for that to happen? Because for students that are watching, in Australia, judges can also be dismissed, but it has to be a vote in the House of Representatives and the Senate on the grounds of proved incapacity or misbehavior. And obviously, the motions of no confidence can be passed. So is it similar to that, where there are certain conditions that have to be fulfilled, or is it something else?
In terms of constitutional changes, so when we actually look at the scope of change that was introduced in 2020, it's, pretty much 60% of the constitution was changed and altered in a relatively short period of time. So 40% of the constitution is changed, expanding the powers of the president, erasing the previous history of presidential terms, giving the president an opportunity to run indefinitely, excluding the rule of having 2 consecutive terms as a limit. It also, again, introduced the power to actually dismiss judges. I think that, again, in theory, it's under very special circumstances. So that's actually articulated in the Constitution. There's a process, and it does need to be with support of the Duma with the 2/3 majority. But so in reality, with that, they enjoy over 70% control of the seats. So if they actually wanted to action anything, that would not be an issue, as the Prime Minister is appointed by the President. They're from the same political background, political parties. So in practice, it would not be a difficult thing to achieve.
Okay, I'll just give it a pause and see if there's any other questions from the audience, because it's rare that you get the opportunity to ask someone who has so much knowledge on this. All right. Can I squeeze one more question in? I know I'm being a bit selfish here.
I will allow it.
Thank you. In the Russian Constitution, Chapter 2 has enshrined rights. This is something that Australia lacks. However, I'm sure being a non-democratic state, you would argue that Russian rights in Russia, are not as well protected. Is that just because there's no follow-up when the government violates those rights? Nobody is taking these issues to the Constitutional Court?
When it comes to Russian judicial process, it is incredibly bureaucratic and incredibly, excuse the expression, tedious. So when it comes to the court system, the costs associated and the wait for the procedures to take place, they're quite often a deterrent for anyone to take action. But also when it comes to the government control of the police and the overlap between the police jurisdiction and powers, and due to the pre-existing issues of corruption, it has become an increasing issue to actually fight for your rights. So historically, even though in theory the rights do exist and they are constitutionally protected, they're not enforced on a day-to-day basis. And that unfortunately has been the reality.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. There's no other questions in the chat. Oh wait, we've got one. So Heidi has asked me, but I'll ask on her behalf. Do you think the Russian people's history of being subjugated under Soviet Russia will prevent the general population from rising up against Putin?
So historically, if we look at the Russian government track record, Russian people have never had good government. So there's a lot of resilience and there's a lot of tolerance. It's just government is something culturally, it's just something you endure, right? So that's just the general attitude of the people. If you look at, any historic Russian photographs of the general population, Russian people don't technically ever smile in the photographs, which I think is a deep reflection of the day-to-day life. When I look at the photos of my grandparents, for instance, not a single photo of them smiling, which reflects day-to-day tradition and just a feeling of oppression and lack of opportunities. It's just a grim reality of the day-to-day life, not having those opportunities, not having much say in how the country is run. There's a lot of just disillusionment with what's happening in the country right now. So when it comes to having another revolution, the key word discontent, right? It would take a lot of people and a lot of organization by the opposition, by those parties with vested interest to actually make a change in order to have any meaningful resistance. But again, it is all ineffective unless you've got support of the army, unless the regime actually turns against the president.
Okay.
Which I suppose if I just add one more point to that, due to the control of the mass media and due to the use of propaganda, especially since the secret military operation, this is also becoming more and more difficult because the general Russian populace is being exposed to only one point of view, where the war in Ukraine is actually presented as a war against Nazism and a war against the West and a war against oppression of the Russian people. And that is the perspective that the government projects onto the population.
All right. So much good information to look at. I'm going to do Russia with my year 11s next year.
Sounds like a plan.
All righty. I think we might call it there because we are ever so slightly out of time. I'd like to thank both Elina and Ben for presenting today. I got so much out of that presentation in terms of both the application of it, how to teach it to my students. If I was a student, I would be looking at certainly how I can take on some of those example paragraph structures, look at how scaffolding can help me build my skills, and then also just the sheer amount of content in that presentation, which will be made available to attendees afterwards. We'll send it through in an email. Thank you so much, all of people in the audience for attending. Please look forward to a Year 11 revision seminar, which is going to be coming up next term. Keep an eye out for that on our social media, whether it be on Twitter, whether it be on Instagram. Please find PLEAWA's accounts. We tweet about contemporary issues all of the time. And other than that, thank you to our presenters, and I will see you all later. Thank you very much.